Hi, let's talk about trauma. Here's the part of the series that might get a bit controversial, but stay with me. My name is Dr. Skiera-Vaughn. I hold a PhD in health psychology. My research focus is on how stress and trauma are conceptualized in other countries. And I'm here to say, potentially traumatic things happen universally. This we know. But what we don't know is always what that looks like, how it's thought about, or how it's experienced by the person who has lived through it, because trauma presents differently and has different meaning depending on the cultural context. I've been in the anti-trafficking world for 13 years. I've worked internationally for 15. Talking about trauma is very, very common. Nearly everyone I know in this space has taken or been trained in some sort of trauma awareness workshop, okay, or trauma informed. But how many have actually sat under training that was not created by someone in the global north, specifically an individualistic culture? Nobody that I know, because it doesn't happen. Or if it does, it happens so rarely that I'm not aware of it. Now, why in the world does this matter? Trauma is trauma. We know that. We know what trauma does, right? Well, every video I've done thus far has been working up to this point. If language influences the way we experience the world, and if we have to appraise a situation as stressful or traumatic in order to experience it as such, and if all expressions of distress are necessarily bound up in cultural norms and values, taken all together, this means we actually don't know what trauma or healing looks like universally. Now, from what I have been able to find after years of asking and searching, I've yet to find a language in anywhere in Latin America, Asia, or Africa that actually has a vernacular traditional word for trauma. A lot don't have a word for stress either, though a couple do. I've yet to find one word for trauma. When people from these regions speak, they import the English word trauma into their language. Trauma, trauma, okay? Which means it's an etic term. It's not a word that a culture has to describe a common phenomenon. Now, stay with me. No word for it means it is conceptualized differently, linguistic relativity, which means it's very likely appraised and experienced differently, cognitive appraisal of stress, which means the symptomology of trauma is necessarily different depending on where you live, cultural expressions of distress. Now, the most recent statistic states that 87% of trauma research has been conducted in high-income countries, 51% U.S. alone, okay? 87% of trauma research is being conducted in high-income countries when only 17% of the world's population lives in a high-income country. Out of all of the studies on trauma, less than 5% have had collaboration with a researcher from a low or middle income country. That accounts for 83% of the world's population. This means the vast majority of studies on trauma are being conducted using only 17% of the global population. We are doing tons and tons of research, thousands, hundreds of thousands of research on trauma is being conducted every year, but only with 17% of the world's population. This means most trauma is being done without taking culture into consideration, and even fewer are being done that take language into consideration. And once again, if we know mental health is culture bound, if we know the language we use influences the way we see and experience and interpret the world, this means the main and accepted understanding of trauma that you see on social media or pop psychology is highly limited. I've experienced this firsthand, as have many of my colleagues who've worked in international settings. What we have been taught to see is not what we see. Now, I often get pushback from this, especially people who have taken lots of trauma workshops, things like that, okay? I will get to the pushback that I often get in my next couple of videos, including biological changes from trauma. What about what happens in the brain? Body keeps the score. PTSD rates in other countries, as well as, well, I've been to another country and I did see what I expected to see. What about that? References are in the caption. Let me know if you have any questions.